Hi, let's take a few minutes to talk about the basics of camera operation. It's really good to have your camera in your hands that you can fiddle with it as you're going through these settings. So if you don't have your camera handy, pause the video, go find your camera, and come back when you've got it. Okay, are we all ready? Let's talk about how to set up your camera to go take some pictures. First, let's talk about file format. There are several choices in your menu. You've got JPEG, RAW, and some cameras have a TIFF. JPEG is a compressed file format. It makes a small file, relatively speaking, which makes for a quick file transfer from the camera to your computer. The downside to a JPEG is the settings are permanent within the file. Things like white balance and noise reduction that are interpreting what the sensor is seeing are written into the file, and you can't change them later. You can mess with it, but you can't change it. You do, if you shoot JPEG, you do want to set a large file with minimal compression so that you get the best file quality possible. RAW isn't really a file format. It's just a proprietary way your camera records the sensor's data. A Nikon is an NEF, for example. A Canon is a CR2 file format. The beauty of a RAW format is that things like noise reduction and white balance don't exist until you get it into the computer. And it allows you to literally change your mind about those settings later. This is my preference for a file format. TIFF is typically used for printing purposes. It's uncompressed. It's a big file with everything written into it. So it's sort of the worst of all possible formats to use in the camera. If you're going to have a big file, you may as well have the RAW file. If you're going to write everything into the file, you may as well have a JPEG. So take a minute and find the file format on your camera. White balance. What is white balance? Well, it's a way that we prevent ourselves from having smurfs in our picture. It defines a neutral or natural interpretation of the color in your image. It has nothing to do with what the sensor sees. If you shoot warm interior light in your house, you can make that neutral. If you then go outside and photograph that same setting in broad daylight, it'll be really blue, but if you set the white balance to daylight, it will be natural. You can set it in the camera for a JPEG. In fact, you have to. You set it in the computer in post-processing when you shoot in RAW. Some of your choices could be daylight, tungsten, flash, fluorescent. You can have color temperature settings as well. 5,000 degrees is daylight. 3,200 degrees is warm TV lights, tungsten lights. And this comes from heating a piece of metal. It starts to glow, and it turns out it glows the same color at the same temperature. You've heard of red hot. Well, 3,200 is kind of orange hot. 5,000 degrees on the Kelvin scale is kind of blue hot. And the Kelvin scale goes up, and at late twilight, you could be at 9,000 or 10,000 degrees Kelvin. 3 ways you can set your white balance. You can set it in fully automatic, where the camera calculates it before every exposure. In this day and age, modern cameras do a really good job of it, and this is where I tend to hang out. You can use a predefined white balance, things like daylight, tungsten, fluorescent, cloudy, mostly what we just talked about. If it's a really squirrely light source, or you're being super fussy and you need to get it right in the camera, you can do a custom preset like the video people do. You photograph a neutral subject, you tell the camera, make this neutral, and it will make that the white balance. Take a minute and find your white balance on your camera. Autofocus gets a little more complicated. There are 2 pairs of settings, and you got to pick one red pair and one green pair here, okay? So you can have single autofocus, where you touch the shutter release lightly or activate the autofocus. It focuses the camera, and it will wait and hold that focus point until you take a picture. The priority here is a sharp image, so it will wait for you to be in focus. Continuous autofocus is going to lock onto your subject and track it as it moves, and it will take the picture not when you push the button, but when the picture is actually taken a fraction of a second later, and it will focus where the subject is going to be after that delay. And within either of those, you can either have single point autofocus, where you define where in the frame the camera is going to focus and manually assign its location, or you can have a dynamic area where the point that it's going to focus is going to move around and the camera will pick what it thinks is your subject. So you could have single autofocus with single point, or single autofocus with dynamic area, or continuous autofocus with single point, or continuous autofocus with a dynamic area. Kind of complicated. You're going to have to play around with this one and see what works for you. So take a minute and see if you can find the autofocus settings on your camera. They're kind of buried in the menus. So the best way to erase your card is to format the card. Don't simply delete the images one by one. And whatever you do, don't delete in the field. You probably can push the delete button faster than the computer can display, and you run the risk of deleting something that you really wanted to keep. The voice of experience here, I've done that. So you want to format the card only after you've downloaded the files to your local computer and you've backed them up to someplace off of your local computer. You're going to hear me say download and back up a lot. It's not that I'm paranoid. Well, actually, yeah, it is that I'm paranoid. Computers do crash, and if your computer goes down, you lose your pictures. Some Nikons have two little green buttons that you can hold both green buttons down for 3 seconds, let up, hold them again, and it'll format the card. Other Nikon users, not so lucky, and I'm sorry, Canon and Sony folks, you don't have that either. Otherwise, it's in the menu, and it's typically not too hard to find. So take a minute and find out how to do it. If your pictures aren't backed up, don't hit OK. Okay? So come back for the next one when we'll talk about camera operation.